What would you do if your neighbor treated your mailbox like it was her personal enemy? Not just once, not twice, but over and over again, as if it had personally wronged her? If someone had told me a year ago that I'd end up in an all-out war over a simple mailbox, I would have laughed in their face. But here I am, recounting the ridiculous saga of how one woman, my neighbor, Karen, managed to turn a harmless object into the source of chaos, legal battles, and, ultimately, her own downfall. At first, it was just a minor inconvenience. One day, I went outside to grab my mail and noticed that my mailbox was a little crooked. Nothing serious, probably just a strong gust of wind or maybe a kid on a bike brushing against it. I straightened it out and moved on with my day. But then it happened again. And again. And again. Every few days, my mailbox would be knocked over or leaning at an odd angle, as if something, or someone, had gone out of their way to mess with it. I started paying more attention. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe I was being paranoid. But then, one morning, I caught a glimpse of something strange. As I was pulling out of my driveway, I saw Karen walking past my house. Just as she reached my mailbox, she shoved it, not hard enough to destroy it, but just enough to push it off balance. She didn't even stop walking, didn't even look around to see if anyone had noticed. Just a casual, almost instinctual act of vandalism, like knocking over a cup that was too close to the edge of a table. That was when I knew, this wasn't some random accident. This was deliberate. My neighbor, a middle-aged woman with far too much time on her hands and a superiority complex the size of Texas, had declared war on my mailbox. And I had no idea why. At first, I tried to be reasonable. Maybe she didn't realize what she was doing. Maybe she thought it was funny. I figured if I just reinforced the mailbox, she'd get bored and move on to some other petty obsession. But I underestimated Karen's sheer determination when it came to things that had absolutely nothing to do with her. The turning point came when I installed a security camera. I didn't even do it because of her, I just wanted some extra home security because there had been a few minor thefts in the area. But on the very first night of reviewing the footage, I saw her. There she was, in the middle of the night, flashlight in hand, wearing a ridiculous floral robe, creeping onto my property like a burglar. And then, with absolutely no hesitation, she kicked my mailbox. Not once, but multiple times. I watched in disbelief as she stomped on it like she was trying to free a trapped hostage. I had to pause the video because I was laughing so hard. Any normal person would have confronted her. Maybe even called the police. But I wanted to see how far she would go. So, instead of saying anything, I simply put the mailbox back up the next morning as if nothing had happened. And then, I waited. The next few nights played out like clockwork. Karen, in her floral robe, flashlight in hand, marching onto my property with a singular mission, to destroy my mailbox. She tried everything. Kicking it, shoving it, even attempting to rip it open with her bare hands. Each morning, I would walk outside, pretending not to notice the slightly more battered state of the poor thing, and simply put it back up. But I knew this routine couldn't last forever. If Karen wanted a war, I was going to make sure I won. And I'd do it with style. I started researching. I looked up reinforced materials, military-grade steel, even considered installing an electric current system before realizing that might land me in actual legal trouble. I needed something that could withstand a hurricane, an earthquake, and, most importantly, the wrath of Karen. That's when I found the answer: titanium. It was indestructible, resistant to impact, and, most importantly, absurdly overkill for a mailbox. Exactly what I needed. A few calls later, I had everything lined up. A locksmith named Mike agreed to install a titanium post, reinforced with concrete, topped with a bulletproof mailbox that could probably survive a tank shell. When the installation day arrived, I stood in my driveway, arms crossed, watching the masterpiece come together. And that's when I saw her. Karen, mid-morning, driving past my house. The moment she saw the fortress of a mailbox being installed, her car slammed on the brakes. She just sat there, gripping the wheel, her face twisted into an expression of pure horror and indignation. I didn't acknowledge her. I simply admired my work, thanked Mike for a job well done, and went inside. But I knew what was coming next. That night, I set up my security feed and settled in with my coffee. Sure enough, around 2 a.m., the camera flickered to life. Karen emerged from her house, the same robe, the same flashlight, the same obsessive determination. She approached the titanium beast, circling it like a predator, testing it with a cautious push. And then, the moment I had been waiting for, she raised her foot and delivered the most aggressive kick yet. The result was nothing short of poetic. The instant her foot made contact, she let out a choked scream and stumbled backward, completely losing her balance. Her flashlight flew from her grip, rolling into the street, and she collapsed onto the pavement, clutching her foot in both hands, muttering a stream of curses. I watched, sipping my coffee, enjoying the show. The next morning, as I stepped outside to grab my paper, I was greeted with the most beautiful sight imaginable. Karen, sitting on her porch, ice pack on her foot, face set in a murderous scowl. She refused to look at me, but I could feel the hatred radiating off of her. I should have known that this wouldn't be the end. Karen had lost the battle, but she was about to escalate the war. That afternoon, I noticed something strange. Other mailboxes in the neighborhood had been vandalized, spray paint, dents, even outright missing posts. And at the center of it all was Karen, standing with a few HOA board members, pointing toward my house. I already knew where this was going. The HOA called a sudden emergency meeting, claiming there had been a wave of destruction in the neighborhood and that certain individuals might be retaliating against community members. Karen, sitting front and center with her injured foot propped up on a chair, wasted no time playing the victim. "I've tried to maintain the integrity of our neighborhood," she began, her voice dripping with fake concern, "but some people just don't respect our standards. And now, look. My mailbox, my neighbors, the Wilsons, all damaged in one night. This kind of behavior is unacceptable." I sat back, arms crossed, hiding my amusement. "And let's be honest," Karen continued, tilting her head toward me. Who in this neighborhood has a reason to lash out? Who installed a military-grade mailbox in some kind of personal vendetta? If anyone had the motivation to retaliate, it's him. I knew she was setting me up. But I was already 2 steps ahead. The HOA president, Mr. Carter, turned to me. "Ethan, do you have anything to say about this?" I leaned forward, pulling out a USB drive and sliding it across the table. "I think this might clear things up." The room fell silent as the security footage played. Karen, at 2 in the morning, hobbling down the street with a can of spray paint in one hand and a hammer in the other, she moved from mailbox to mailbox, causing destruction with her own 2 hands. The best part, the video ended with her limping back to her house, muttering angrily to herself. The silence in the room was glorious. Karen's face drained of color as the HOA board turned to glare at her. "Karen," Mr. Carter said slowly, rubbing his temples. "Would you care to explain?" She stammered, her hands flailing. I was investigating. I saw someone outside, and I was trying to stop them." Nobody bought it. The HOA dismissed the meeting immediately, siding with me. Karen had been caught red-handed, and though they didn't take action yet, it was clear her influence was crumbling. But she wasn't done yet. That evening, I spotted a sleek black sedan pulling into Karen's driveway. I recognized the license plate immediately. She had hired a lawyer. And just like that, the mailbox war was about to get legal. The moment I saw the lawyer's car parked in Karen's driveway, I knew exactly what was coming. She had lost every battle so far, and instead of admitting defeat like any reasonable person, she was about to take the pettiest route possible, suing me over a mailbox. Sure enough, the next day, I received a formal notice in the mail. Karen was suing me, claiming that I had intentionally installed a dangerous structure to cause harm to others. She cited her injured foot as proof that my maliciously reinforced mailbox posed a serious risk to the neighborhood. I nearly choked on my coffee when I read it. This woman had spent months destroying my property, and now she wanted to make me the villain because she kicked solid titanium like a complete idiot? I had half a mind to throw the notice in the trash and forget about it, but I wasn't about to let Karen rewrite history. If she wanted a fight in court, I'd give her one. A week later, we both arrived at the courthouse. Karen limped in dramatically, her foot wrapped in thick bandages, looking like she had barely survived a shark attack instead of kicking a mailbox. Her lawyer, a pompous man named Mr. Reynolds, strutted in like he was about to uncover the crime of the century. The judge wasted no time. "Ms. Karen, your lawyer may present your case." Reynolds stood up, adjusting his tie with the confidence of a man who didn't yet realize he was about to lose spectacularly. "Your Honor, my client has suffered severe injuries due to the reckless actions of the defendant," he began, gesturing dramatically to Karen. "This mailbox was intentionally fortified beyond normal standards, creating a hazardous, unmarked obstacle in a residential area. The defendant had full knowledge of the risks and yet failed to take any precautions to prevent harm to others." I almost laughed. I was now apparently the architect of a deadly mailbox trap. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Ethan, how do you respond?" I leaned back in my chair, smiling. "Your Honor, my neighbor destroyed 3 of my mailboxes before I installed this one. I just wanted to make sure it wouldn't get knocked over again." The judge frowned. "Do you have any proof of this?" I pulled a USB drive from my pocket and handed it over. Seconds later, the courtroom erupted into muffled laughter as the footage played. Karen, kicking, shoving, and even at one point trying to pry open my mailbox with her bare hands. And then, the grand finale, the moment she slammed her foot into the titanium post and collapsed in agony. The judge paused the video at the exact moment of impact, her face twisted in pure regret. He rubbed his temples before sighing. "Ms. Karen, did you kick the structure of your own free will?" Karen shifted in her seat, sweating. I didn't know it was so hard." The judge's patience had run out. Case dismissed. "Next." Karen's jaw dropped. Her lawyer choked on his own argument. "And I?" I walked out of that courtroom without spending a single cent on legal fees. Karen, however, wasn't just humiliated, she was livid. As she limped out of the courthouse, she muttered something under her breath that I couldn't quite hear. But I had a feeling that this wasn't over. I was right. A few days later, the neighborhood gossip started swirling. Karen was circulating a petition, trying to get my mailbox removed. But instead of using her usual HOA, aesthetic, excuse, she was now claiming that it posed an imminent danger to the children of the neighborhood. There was just one problem. There were no children in the neighborhood. The closest thing we had to a kid was Max, an elderly Labrador who spent most of his time sleeping on porches. And unless Karen thought my mailbox was somehow threatening a 13-year-old dog with arthritis, her argument made absolutely no sense. But Karen didn't care about logic. She was determined to get her way. The first time she knocked on a neighbor's door, Mrs. Henderson, a no-nonsense retired schoolteacher, listened to her entire rant before responding with the sweetest, most polite door slam I had ever seen. The second house? Mr. Wallace. He took one look at Karen's petition and let out a booming laugh. "Karen, for God's sake, give it a rest." But the best part? One of our neighbors, Sarah, got a hold of Karen's petition and turned it into something else entirely. Instead of asking people to remove my mailbox, she rewrote it as a petition to remove Karen from the neighborhood. Within 3 days, it had twice as many signatures as Karen's original petition. Karen didn't realize it yet, but she had just sealed her own fate. Karen had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood, issuing bogus fines, and dictating absurd rules, but for the first time, the power she'd clung to so desperately was slipping through her fingers. She had been humiliated in court, caught vandalizing mailboxes, and now, thanks to her own arrogance, her desperate attempt to turn the neighborhood against me had completely backfired. I knew she wouldn't take this defeat gracefully. She never did. But I wasn't expecting her next move, a desperate attempt to bribe the HOA. It started with whispers. A few neighbors mentioned seeing Karen hosting private gatherings, exclusive little dinners with HOA board members, the same ones who had once supported her ridiculous rules. Then, Mr. Carter, the head of the HOA, suddenly announced a vote on new regulations concerning overly reinforced structures that disrupt neighborhood aesthetics. I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly what that meant. Karen had failed to get rid of my mailbox through force, failed to remove it through legal means, and failed to manipulate the neighborhood against me. Now, she was trying to change the rules entirely, hoping to ban my mailbox retroactively. But what she didn't know was that one of the board members, an honest guy named Mr. Carter, had been recording everything. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up expecting the usual nonsense. Karen, sitting smugly, her eyes darting toward me every few seconds. The board members, whispering amongst themselves, clearly uneasy. And then Mr. Carter stood up and cleared his throat. "Before we vote on this new proposal," he said, "I think it's important that everyone hears something first." He pulled out his phone, pressed a button, and Karen's own voice filled the room. "Look, we both know this neighborhood is better when I'm in charge. If you make this whole, reinforced mailbox thing a violation, I'll make sure the board approves your expansion request. You help me, I help you." Silence. Karen's face turned white. "Besides, we need to set a precedent. Otherwise, what's next? People building bunkers in their front yards?" I had to bite my cheek to keep from laughing. The room exploded. The very board members Karen had tried to bribe were furious. They had been caught in her web of manipulation, and now everyone knew it. The vote never even happened. Instead, Mr. Carter turned the meeting against Karen completely. "There have been too many complaints about Ms. Karen's conduct over the years," he said. "And frankly, I think it's time we discuss what to do about it." Karen shot up from her seat. "You can't do this. I've given everything to this neighborhood," she shrieked, but no one was listening anymore. The neighbors, who had once feared her wrath, now spoke freely, about the unfair fines, the harassment, the constant interference in people's lives. And then, Sarah, the same woman who had flipped Karen's petition against her, stood up, holding the stack of papers. "I think we've already decided," she said, holding up the petition for Karen's removal. The signatures were overwhelming. Karen's face contorted in disbelief as she realized what was happening. The HOA took an official vote. Unanimous. Karen was officially expelled from the neighborhood. She had 30 days to sell her house and leave. And just like that, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA had been dethroned. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive. People who had barely spoken to each other before were suddenly laughing, chatting, and bonding over a shared victory, the downfall of Karen. It was as if a storm had finally passed, and in its wake, the entire community had come together in a way it never had before. Karen, however, was not handling her defeat well. For weeks, she sulked on her porch, watching the world move on without her. The for sale sign went up in front of her house, standing there like a final, silent humiliation. Every time I walked by, I made sure to give her a friendly wave. Sometimes she pretended not to see me. Other times, I could feel the heat of her glare burning into the back of my head. I wasn't the only one enjoying the moment. The neighbors who had once feared her petty wrath now greeted her with barely concealed amusement. The same people she had fined over minor infractions, the same families she had harassed over nonsense HOA rules, now took every opportunity to celebrate her departure. And then, one day, she was simply gone. No farewell. No drama. Just a moving truck, a car packed with suitcases, and then, nothing. It was over. The HOA had a new, reasonable board. The neighborhood became a place where people actually enjoyed living again. The absurd restrictions Karen had enforced? Gone. The fear of ridiculous fines? Vanished. And best of all, my titanium mailbox stood proudly, untouched. It's funny how one person can turn something as simple as a mailbox into a war, and how, in the end, it wasn't a battle of strength but a battle of patience. Karen had always relied on control, manipulation, and intimidation, but when the neighborhood finally stood up to her, she had nothing left. Looking back, it still amazes me how far she was willing to go, the vandalism, the fake lawsuit, the bribery. And for what? A mailbox? Or was it something deeper, an unwillingness to accept that she couldn't control everything around her? Whatever the reason, it didn't matter anymore. Karen was gone. The neighborhood was finally free. And my mailbox? Still standing strong. Have you ever dealt with a Karen or an HOA nightmare that got out of control? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.